Hello, I'm David Hepworth. Thanks for clicking this word in your ear, the latest of hundreds of chats Marc, Ellen and I have had over recent years, some between ourselves and others with musicians, authors, comedians, and other people we like. If you'd like to help make sure they continue, you might consider being a Patreon supporter by visiting patreon.com/wordinyourear, or just by liking or subscribing in whatever way you prefer. On with the show.
Well, welcome to this. Dave and I spent years reviewing records, all of which came with a press release written by an overexcited PR. And we usually just glanced at those and chucked them in the bin. But this hefty and sumptuous book, Pressing News, has tracked down scores of these old handouts, these from 1962 to 1972. And they're a fascinating time capsule into how pop music was sold at the time. This is the time being before, words like psychedelic and prog were invented. Thus, we discover that Charlie Watts has over 100 pocket handkerchiefs, and Joe Cocker's favourite drink is cremola foam. These things are important. And it's edited by Richard Morton Jack. Richard, it's lovely to see you again.
Thank you. Yeah, lovely to see you.
Great to see you. I remember that room from the last time we talked to you, where we were talking about your Nick Drake book. That's a sensational collection of records behind you, and posters.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, one leads to the next and you never end. It's terrible. But can I just say on the subject of cremola foam, this might be the only opportunity ever for posterity to discuss it. I looked up what it is because I'd never heard of it. This is Joe Cocker's favourite drink, according to his questionnaire that Decca sent out in 1964. They were little sachets for children with fizzy powder in, which you mix with water or milk maybe, and ended up with some indescribable potion. Which he was.
You drink two of those, you'd be bouncing off the ceiling.
Yes, exactly. Not very good for your teeth, but I don't think 60s pop stars cared too much about their teeth.
No. I think if I can add a further detail on the subject of cremola foam, I think it was only available if you had it delivered. I don't think you could buy it in a shop.
Couldn't get it in the shops.
It was kind of odd subscription thing, I seem to remember.
Getting more and more suspicious.
No, it wasn't suspicious, but it was just, delightfully illicit, really.
There were probably very sound health reasons for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure there were. Well, I'm sure it was out of commission almost immediately. Yeah. But now, look, tell us how, where the idea came from for this book and how it was all assembled.
Well, I personally fundamentally just find press releases quite interesting myself because they're such vivid little windows into the past. And so I started squirreling them away when I came across them over the years. And occasionally they'd be inside an album or I'd see one on eBay or whatever it might have been. And I got to the point where I just bought every single one that I came across because no one else seemed to want them. And it seemed counterintuitive to me that people were so desperate to get hold of these LPs and singles from that 60s and 70s period, but weren't remotely interested in the promotional materials that had gone alongside them, which in strict terms of rarity, logically speaking, have to be harder to find. They would have only made, 50 or 100 press releases compared to whatever the press release album was.
It's true. It's astonishing, really, they survived at all because they were so disposable.
I'm now thinking of the thousands, literally thousands, that I have, as Marc described, screwed up and thrown in the bin. And you're saying that people like you pay for them?
Yeah, well, that's the funny thing. I mean, there aren't many people like me who pay for them, thankfully.
It doesn't have to be.
There'd be more competition. But no one, when they see them, says, let's chuck that in the bin now. I mean, I think people recognize their value for historical or just curiosity purposes. But I started putting these inside album covers as and when I could. And it slowly occurred to me that it would be nice to make a book out of them. So I chose a selection that I thought would go nicely and chronologically. But as I started thinking about it last year, it just seemed that it was only a half-cooked project if I didn't also include press that reflected what the sheets had tried to communicate or not, and to see how the records had landed in the moment. And what was really interesting to me was seeing in the days before Marc Bolan or David Bowie or you name it were household names, even in their own households, how their records were being marketed and what they were already saying and doing that they would carry on doing when they were famous.
And it's also interesting to those little news clippings, how much people take the information on the press releases and kind of use it as editorial. There's a brilliant one about the zombies where it says the zombies have 50 GCSEs between them, which I'm sure was patently untrue. But this is just trotted out parrot fashion, isn't it, by all the local press saying they're very well educated, the zombies, 50 GCSEs, you know. So
yes.
People were prepared to just accept whatever they were told, really, because they were grateful for the editorial.
Absolutely grateful for not having to write an article themselves. And in fact, the very first Beatles press release, which we might talk about in detail, is quite an interesting example of the
yes,
genre.
Let's get that one up. Yeah.
That actually has a section where it says, you know, there's a review included, and it says, please just run this. You know, they knew that Tony Barrow knew that he'd be doing his fellow hacks a favour by giving them an oven-ready review to print.
Just copy out this review.
Yeah.
5 stars.
Absolutely.
I think it's really interesting, the Beatles one, because it's have you found that, Dave? It's page 17, I think, and it's all about the 4 different personalities. John Lennon likes Brigitte Bardot and Chuck Berry. Paul McCartney's ambition is money, etc. George Harrison, egg and chips and Eartha Kitt, and Ringo Starr, Donald Duck, and drives a Ford Zodiac. That's your basic, you know, that's your way of trying to differentiate the 4 of them. And what other things?
I think it's important to emphasise that Ringo does not like Donald Duck.
Oh, he doesn't like Donald Duck.
No, I think it would be. I wouldn't like your podcast give the impression that he does.
No, that's true. I read that in a hurry. I thought he did. No, these things. We must get that sorted out immediately before the lawyers are in touch.
It's a slightly peculiar thing for him to single out. As a dislike in life, but yeah, they gave all this curious kind of bitty information, which can seem a bit laughable and quaint. But on the other hand, these press releases were serving quite a wide readership in theory. So they were being sent to the cynics at Melody Maker and the jazz pub press or whatever it might be. But they were also going to Bunty and Valentine and Boyfriend. Yeah. So the information in them had to be reserviceable to quite a wide variety of age groups. Hence,
and what else did they pick up on? Things like the fact they were a harmonica playing group, wasn't it? Was one thing. Also, the word Beatles, the name the Beatles was just the thing they made a big deal about.
Yes, and I suppose
it weren't insects.
I suppose the harmonica was a reasonably unusual instrument.
I've just noticed at the top of the first one, Meet the Beatles, and then the subhead underneath is Beatles Drive. And of course, do you remember what a Beatle Drive was? You don't, do you? You're both too young. Okay, let me take you back to the early 60s. Beatle was a game played by, church groups would get together and they'd have a Beatle Drive, spelled B-E-E-T-L-E. And so that was obviously a play on that expression. I'd never seen that before.
But Beatle was actually a game.
Beatle, B-E-E-T-L-E, was a game. I can't remember exactly how it works, but go and look it up. It used to be very widespread back in the day.
But that's fascinating because I've been reading about the Beatles for as long as I can remember, like you guys have, and I've never known that there would have been another association for...
Well, I think very, very quickly they obliterated the previous association. You know what I mean? So
they did.
They suddenly...
Once they became well known, you just didn't think about how quaint or weird the name was, as is the case with all groups,
Yeah.
But a few pages later on, Dave, we could go to...
Sorry, Mark, to interrupt. Can I just say on that Beatles one, because I think it's quite an interesting example of something about them. Brian Epstein paid specifically to have a multi-page Beatles handout made with a pink cover. And normally EMI or Decca or Pi would send out their press release on their headed paper. But for Love Me Do, no one had ever heard of the Beatles. No one knew who they were. They were just a bunch of oiks from up north as far as the London press was concerned. But Brian Epstein had such fire in his belly about them that he paid for this. I mean, unique might be an exaggeration, but I haven't seen another. Maybe in the film game, people did things like that. But for an unknown pop group to have a pink front cover and several pages with a variety of information, some surreal Goon Show style jokes, here you go, print this review, like we said earlier. and also a selection of previous comments about them, and then a variety of phone numbers you could contact for this person, that person, or the other person. It's not a surprise that the Beatles, made more of a stir than many pop groups did in that with their first single, when you can see the passion that was behind them.
No, sure.
That's true.
They've got George Martin's phone number is on there as well.
Yes, you can ring up George Martin.
Ring George Martin.
So you don't like the mix on the B-side.
No, there'd be people trying to approach them with songs and so forth.
Yeah.
That's what they've been trying to do. It's absolutely fascinating. So what were you about to say, Mark? I was
going to mention the Julie Driscoll thing, which goes about 4 or 5 pages later, because the other amazing thing about the book is you discover that there is a past to a lot of people you associate with a different time. And there's Julie Driscoll. I think it's page 22, Dave, and she's a kind of singer-songwriter, sort of, well, just not even before singer-songwriter. She's an acoustic troubadour, isn't she?
There she is.
And she's, with her acoustic guitar. And the only thing they've got to say about her in the press release, really, is that she's had the kind of chutzpah to go into an independent producer's office and sit down with her guitar and play. And it was on the strength of that she's got the deal, which is the story that everybody goes with. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because, again, with all these press releases, they can't think what they can say apart from finding something characterful that might make a news story.
I think it's also interesting to me that people like Julie Driscoll and others clearly were ambitious.
Yes.
The story, they love the rags to riches story that they just happened to be overheard singing to themselves in a train carriage, and next thing they knew it, they were in a studio. But actually, the link in the chain that often these press releases leave out is that these were very focused and ambitious young people.
Absolutely. I was just looking at the Marc Bolan one earlier, when he's 17 or something like this, isn't he? And he's written about by George Melly, and he claims to have backpacked around the continent of Europe, come from a family of costermongers, neither of which is true at all. He was just making up stories about himself,
let alone having lived with a wizard in Paris.
There was an owl called Archimedes. That's right. Yeah. It's fantastic. No, I think it's so interesting. There's the Kinks appears just a few pages later, David, and they're sold as 4 art students who dress like characters from Dickens. And it's really all about their clothes. The majority of it's about their capes and their way out leather accessories. And that's, again, you can see why, because what they're saying is print a picture of these guys. That's all we want you to do, and then comment on how fantastic they look.
Yeah, and it was differentiation, obviously. So many beat groups, especially in the eyes of the middle-aged, jaded mainstream journalists for the broadsheet, were the same as each other. They were interchangeable. So if you could have a gimmick or something about you which made you stand out, whether it was your hair or the clothes you wore, etc., or the fact you'd gone to private school, or each group, they had a certain thing they would absolutely fixate upon, or having lots of GCSEs to make you stand out from the pack. So you see that as a theme time and again. They would try to highlight something that was made their little group distinctive for that week's release.
And there's a major change, I think, with the Stones, which is just about maybe 5 pages after that, Dave. And the Stones are kind of sold as being uncompromising. And it's the idea that they're the first group that you meet they're not selling themselves that strongly. They're not saying, please love us, And Brian is, we're told, smokes 60 cigarettes a day. They're quite hard, aren't they, And that's different, I think.
Yes, I think, obviously, that having the PR genius, is that too strong a word? Andrew Oldham, for that era anyway. I mean, he just read so brilliantly how to exploit the Stones and get them coverage and confect outrage and so on. And whilst it might seem that they were just kind of holding the game in contempt, actually they were playing it as hard as everyone else. They were just coming at it from a different angle. With Andrew Oldham very carefully puppeteering this image of them as being louts and all the rest.
Absolutely.
Which, in fact, obviously they weren't.
They were far, far posher and far better educated than the Beatles. The Beatles were genuinely working class,
Right. And most
really
people who did encounter the Stones said that they were quite charming and funny and had time for their fans and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
That they were...
Another one I liked, Dave, was on I think page 48 is Joe Cocker, because Joe Cocker it's quite hard to sell because he's not conventionally pretty. Page 48 was it?
Yeah.
And they sell him as being somebody who worked for 5 years, I think, as a gas fitter. And then you notice that the press themselves are trying to find an angle. And one of them find the angle that the publicity boys, they say he has a face like the back of a Sheffield Corporation bus. And they print that so that they then can get reaction from various girl fans that this is not true. They find him adorable. So it's a case of the press desperately trying to find something to say about this guy, isn't it?
Yeah, poor Joe. That's a tough accusation to live down in your debut release.
But it's still the case, isn't it? Joe Cocker no longer with us. But, you know, when Joe Cocker first appeared on the scene, he did a Beatles song, didn't he? I'll Cry Instead or something like that. And all anybody knew about him was he was a gas fitter from Sheffield.
Yeah.
Both facts were considered really interesting and made him unique. Many years later, even after all the Mad Dogs and Englishmen and all that stuff, he was still being written about as a gas fitter from Sheffield because those facts had lodged themselves in the popular imagination. It's like Sandy Shaw and the Bare Feet. You know, once those things attach themselves to people, they don't go away. Or they don't go away readily.
Yeah, I suppose there's something slightly comical about the phrase gas fitter.
Yes.
There is.
Not that there's anything comical about the job itself, but I think it's also quite interesting that someone like Joe Cocker could plausibly sell a large number of records in the Northeast or their part of England and be a profitable artiste for Decca without having a hit. And you realise, looking at some of these press releases, that these guys were big names in Cardiff or in Newcastle or wherever it might have been without being anywhere near the hit parade. But that still made them worthwhile.
That's true. You can make a profit out of them.
Yeah.
That's right. That's true.
And the number of records you had to sell was terrifying in those days to be in the charts. So you could still sell a good few thousand, low thousands. Out, just in your hometown and be a star there and be mobbed wherever you went around Newcastle, but not be a big star much beyond.
One of the valuable services you perform in this book is reminders of that really brief period when things change so rapidly. I don't think they ever change so rapidly again. I'm talking about 1967, when suddenly everybody had to have a Charlie Chan mustache and a kind of caftan or some concession to the kind of hippie garb. It just happened with absolutely everybody, didn't it? Really quickly. And they suddenly started having to say that their songs are about different things. You know, they weren't about romance anymore. They were about visions and weirdness. There's never been a change so quick in popular music ever, has there? I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, it swept through, didn't it? In probably, as of the summer of '66, things started going a bit at the edges.
Yeah,
in the charts.
It's the moment the Beatles produced moustaches, and then everybody in the music industry too. It's a floral shirt and a moustache, isn't it?
Yes, and records got so fun and colourful and silly, and then the band came along and ruined everything.
That's true. We could jump ahead to the psychedelia stuff, Dave. Do you want to do that? Or do you want to stay where?
Well, no. Tell me where to go. Go on.
I was thinking
speaking of the psychedelia, something I think is quite interesting in that period in sort of '67, and you can tell it from the material in the book, quite apart from anything else, is that no one predicted that Procol Harum was going to have this big. Obviously, Tony Hall and Denny Cordell and those who had been involved in it knew a hit when they heard one. But that, at a time of probably as intense competition as there has ever been for the number one slot, that went to number one within 3 weeks of being released, I think, and they were an unheard of proposition.
Yeah.
And it just emphasizes, and again, these press releases, you can see it time and again, they've got no idea who's going to have a number one and be a megastar and who's going to disappear and be on the bus back home to Hartlepool. You know, they just have no idea. So it's quite fun reading these completely cold and seeing how level the playing field was at the time of release for all these singles.
But also there's something very exciting, I think, about the fact that your book gives just as much space a lot of the time to the groups that have completely disappeared off the face of the earth.
An example of that, I'm looking here. I've got to look at a spread devoted to the Tickle, a group I'd never heard of.
I'd never heard of the Tickle.
The Tickle.
They were Tony Visconti's proteges. After he got off the boat from America. Yeah, they were, again, they'd been hard at it. They were seasoned session guys and had made another single under a different name. But the Tickles angle was that their material was selected by computer and that there was a
That's it.
I don't know if you remember in Carry On Loving, the dating machine where you feed in a paper and it gets spat out the other end. Anyway, and it's all a con. But the Tickles machine sounds a bit like that, where they typed in what they wanted, and apparently this computer that their manager had devised would tell them exactly what to record. But this was duly repeated everywhere they were mentioned. The single was a complete flop, and that was that. But Mick Wayne, their guitarist, went on to play with David Bowie as a result of the Visconti connection. So there's a minor footnote to the footnote.
There always seems something faintly tragic about the groups that don't make it and their concerted efforts to try and get attention. Whereas, of course, when the groups who did that became successful, you're completely forgiving about it. There's a group called The Eyes. I don't think I never heard of them actually. There are 5 supermods. The press release says 5 supermods with rainbow-coloured stage wear. And they never get there. And then there's The Virgin Sleep, The Accent, Rainbow Folly, Bill Fay, Bread, Love and Dreams, and Help Yourself. I mean, all those I'd never really got across my radar at all.
Yeah, well, most of the ones you just mentioned were sort of one-off singles groups.
Yeah.
And maybe bad luck played its part, but to some extent, some of these groups maybe only had one single in them. But they're such good singles.
Yes.
It's really the sort of singles you hear once and you think, I really enjoyed that. Good riff, good arrangement, good tune, etc. Weird bit in the middle with phasing. They were just fun and strange and plausibly could have been hits. And Decca obviously had and Decca did put out more than any one of these. EMI too, I suppose.
Yeah.
Had no idea what was going to be a hit or what wasn't, what was going to land. And they had so much money swilling around. They could afford to record these Herberts, crack out a press release and see what happened. So it was just this wonderful sense of constant releases, and they're throwing mud at the wall. Great fistfuls of it.
We could go back and look at Rod Stewart. There's an interesting one, Dave. Did you see that one on page 55? Because I think he's the first example of a press release where somebody is being deliberately sold as a rebel. There's a whole story about how Rod Stewart lived on a houseboat with 20 other beatniks, and they get arrested by the police, and the boat is eventually sunk, and he gets on the front page of the local paper. It's all about, well, it's not the first time, the last time he'll be on the front of the local paper. So he is being presented as he's kind of outside the law, and a bit of none of that kind of clean cut stuff about him at all, really.
No, he was a genuine beatnik, Rod.
Yeah, he was.
He'd bummed around Europe, and he had actually lived the life. And he was quite serious. Well, he still is underneath it all. But he was a serious student of the music that he loved, the folk and the blues. And that single of his is good. It's acoustic. It's not rock and roll. It's quite a heavy acoustic blues number. It's again, lack of joined up thinking or whatever. But EMI and Decca both released songs called Good Morning Little Schoolgirl on the same day.
Yeah.
One by Rod, one by the Yardbirds. They were actually different songs.
Yes.
But hopeless. They were never both going to get played. And I think that holds Rod beneath the waterline. The
Yardbirds is another good example because their press release makes their main selling point is they're not phonies. And I love that idea that was a time when authenticity suddenly became really important, and everybody else might look a bit cheesy and superficial in comparison. That's a change, isn't it?
Yes, that sense that they were purveying the real blues when the Manfred Manns and co had slightly sold out to the hit parade. And
yes,
they were. And Eric, to be fair, I think was quite serious about authenticity and purity in those days. And as we all know, he left the Yardbirds when they had their big hit because it was where he wanted to go.
So how do you get a book like this published? I mean, I'm holding it up now. It's absolutely enormous. It's incredibly heavy.
Yeah, it's not easy to find printers that can do it.
How do you get a publisher? It's
my company that published it.
Oh, okay, right.
Right.
Fine.
Yeah.
Fine. So you didn't have to go and sell the idea to somebody else.
No, for books like this, I always do them myself because I know so clearly what I want them to look like and feel like that I don't want to compromise on anything.
Yeah, yeah.
But getting it printed at that size is a pain, I must say.
Where do you get it printed? Can you get it done in the UK?
No, the Czech Republic.
Right, yes.
Yeah. Oh, amazing.
Yeah.
It's the Czech Republic. And it's the right kind of paper because it's not shiny art paper, but it's
matte, isn't it? It's beautiful.
Yes.
It feels like a very good quality version of an actual newspaper, doesn't it? Of a copy of the Melody Maker or something.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we wanted. You lose a bit in terms of the colour because you can't reproduce colours on that sort of paper quite as brightly. But the feeling of the old newspaper is what we want.
Right. So who are you aiming a book like this at?
I don't know really. Anyone who's interested in it. I think there's so much history in it, and there's so much, so many odds and ends that I hope anyone who's got a passing interest in that era will find things of interest in it. But it doesn't really have a target audience particularly, I don't think.
Right.
But as a historical document, as it were, I do think it's interesting that they're talking about types of music that haven't yet been defined. And I find that really, really interesting. There's particularly the Pink Floyd, because no one at that point has invented the term psychedelia. And so the press release just describes C. Emily players, a number with a lyrical atmosphere whose words express a feeling rather than tell a story.
Yeah.
So you've got that thing where the press are trying to keep up, but don't quite understand what's going on.
Yeah, but of course, the press release was written in each case, or in most cases, by people who were aiming them at journalists and broadcasters, not at the end consumer. And so they were desperately, these unfortunate people in the PR departments of the record company were having to interpret the ravings of Syd Barrett or whoever it might have been, which probably was the last.
Somebody in a cardigan. That's right. With a bottle of brown ale on there.
Repeat it again. Yes. So you end up with this slightly absurd attempt by people to enthuse about music, which clearly leaves them completely cold themselves.
There's a very good example with the Fairport Convention, because the story of the Fairport Convention, they're trying to work out which one the sex throb in the group is. It says Martin Lamble was once held to be the white hope sex throb of the convention until Ian Matthews turned up. And you're thinking, this is extraordinary. That this is a kind of really interesting folk rock group, and it's a completely original kind of music, but their way of getting people's attention is saying which one's the looker, So
yes. Probably with a minor element of piss taking. They loved their Beano and so on, the Fairport crew.
Although, to be fair, I mean, Mark and I have both been on the other end of this, as the kind of, we've seen press releases get very pretentious and so forth. But in the end, when you see a new group come along, you tend to look at a picture and go, that's the looker.
Oh, yeah.
That's
when we were in Smash
poster.
Hits, we would get, so we've got a new group called Duran Duran. We'd say, look, could you send around the pictures? We would never say send around the records. Send around the pictures. We'd put them on the light box, and we'd stand over them, wouldn't we, Dave? We'd say, which one's the looker? Which one's the back page poster? What about the bass player, John Taylor? He looks great, So, that's the way you look at it. There's one more point I just wanted to make, which I thought was really interesting, which is just a new type of male star appears at one point. The best examples being Nick Drake and Scott Walker. And they're both kind of what I suppose I'd describe as beta males. They're sensitive, they're shy. Nick Drake is sold to somebody who doesn't have a telephone and disappears for 4 days at a time and was traveling in Europe and came back because of health reasons. And Scott Walker, his press release says, he's at the mercy of a nervous disposition, and thus he's liable to pick up any lurking bacteria or virus. So it's the idea that, he needs mothering, really, It's a completely unusual way of selling somebody.
Yeah, extraordinary. I think a lot of these press releases were aimed, obviously, at local newspapers as well as national. In fact, the national press had very little coverage of pop. In the news pages, they might report something. Yeah. Otherwise, they might have every fortnight a pop page. but they didn't have a daily or a weekly.
No, that's true. They would have a columnist, wouldn't they? Yeah.
They'd have a columnist who usually also covered the magistrates' courts or whatever and would be allowed to do a bit of pop occasionally. Teens and 20s column or whatever they'd call it.
Yes.
And so...
seen and heard.
The spinning disc. That's right.
So that's why in the book you get things like the Lichfield, whatever it was called, covers Jeremy Spencer and Fleetwood Mac because he's a local boy. And that's valuable to CBS to get that coverage. And similarly, one of the most amusing sagas, which I don't think has ever been written about really, but Robert Plant, who, whether or not you like his voice, he was obviously, it's not controversial to say what a preeminent rock singer he is and always has been. Yeah. But the narrative usually is that Robert Plant came fully formed in 1968 to Jimmy Page's door, sort of with a ribbon tied around him as a little gift from the skies. And the reality is Robert Plant had been hustling hard for years. And his first record came out in, he joined a group called Listen, which was signed to CBS in 1966. Almost immediately, they announced that he had changed his name to Rob with a 3 RT instead of with an E.
Oh, wow.
That got into the local press in the Midlands. Then they announced that Listen were joining the Noise Abatement Society because they objected to the volume other groups were playing at. Got into the local press in the Midlands. Then a local factory went on strike and Listen turned up and tried to play a concert for the picketers and got screamed at and shouted at and told to F off. That got into the local papers. Then he got done for a driving offence in the summer of 67, by which time he was in the Band of Joy, and he orchestrated a little protest outside the courtroom for legalisation of marijuana. That got onto, believe it or not, with a big picture of him, the front page of the Daily Mirror. So Robert Plant had a national front page photo of himself with accompanying story, well before Jimmy Page had ever heard of him. That still didn't make any difference to his fortunes. And then he was also in the national press and in all of the music press in December 67, delivering a letter to the Chinese embassy saying that the Band of Joy were willing to go and play in China to promote Sino-British relations. And Robert Plant was doing absolutely everything he could to sell himself and to get into the press and to promote himself. And these press releases and these cuttings tell you that backstory.
That's fantastic, isn't it? And then when successful,
like David Bowie, the similar.
Yeah,
he was.
Well, the long hair society.
The long hair is the big story for David Jones and the lower third, isn't it?
Absolutely. And then he said he'd gone off to Tibet and joined a monastery, which turned out to be a bit of a fabrication, and then all the mime stuff. And he was constant. We know that about him. But even then, long before he was a household name, he was absolutely trying to think of ways to get his next record across.
It's really interesting because it was kind of assumed at the time, probably quite rightly, that the music alone would not be enough with any of these people. That if you're going to get people's attention, you had to have a gimmick, didn't you? You had to have something that was going to get in the Daily Mirror.
Yes,
well, isn't that the case? That's why the book's so important because it's about press. Without press, you couldn't really have got radio. So that was your first, and without radio would get you a hit. But unless the press really sold you, the radio probably wouldn't notice. That's probably true, isn't it?
I suppose so. But it's also just things like flower power. It was an umbrella under which loads of people could shelter. And if you suddenly flower power was a story. It wasn't anything to do with the music. It was just songs that mentioned flowers. And therefore DJs and newspaper editors would just talk about it. And so if you had the word flower in the title of your song, you were going to get played for that 6-month period. And then it would be something else. But it wasn't because you had an interesting sound or anything like that, It was the Kinks hunting jackets, and that was the kind of stuff.
Yeah, the riding boots, the whips. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and go on.
Yeah, there was an element in which, in the early 60s, the assumption had always been that what people wanted to become was an entertainer, and you wanted to be a TV presenter, and you wanted to be doing panto, and that pop was your route into being an entertainer. And obviously that was changing for musicians faster than it perhaps was for the press, who was still looking at these people as people who were fundamentally hoping just for a generic showbiz career.
Yeah.
So, you'll often find in these press releases people talk about films. There's been interest from a film company, and it's not enough that you've written a great record and that's what you're doing. There's always a suggestion that there's something else that you're hoping to achieve, that this will, give you more longevity as an entertainer. And again, with Bowie, you get that the whole time. That the coverage is about that he's hoping to be in a film, and he's had 3 film offers, and
yes,
as if. Well, in his case, it was true, wasn't it? He wanted to do all those things.
Right? Yeah, that's true. But then by about 1968, you get a slight sense of ennui creeping in, and again, the charge, perhaps led by Andrew Oldham, the press releases start coming from independent PR firms rather than always from the record companies.
Yeah.
Start being a bit more elaborate, start being a bit more mischievous, and it's no longer sufficient just to trot out what it said on the press release for the papers. A bit more is expected or needed. And so to promote Ogden's Nut Gone Flake, Immediate sent out a parody of the Lord's Prayer, which led to sort of confected outrage that it was blasphemous, and they found some tame vicar who was willing to give him a few words about long-haired layabouts or whatever it was. And the Deviants album Disposable, I was amused to see in one of the little cuttings I found, was sent out to all the reviewers wrapped in a bin bag. So they started realizing, which is quite modern really, that you needed to do a bit more than just send out a PR sheet that mentioned kinky clothes to go to the top of the pile.
So you presumably couldn't do a follow-up to this book, could you? Because that was the golden age of those kind of that kind of communication, wasn't it?
Well, I left out more than I included, so I mean, I could certainly do the same again. I decided.
But could you do could you do sort of 72 to 82? Because I wonder if it'd be the same. Really, I don't know. I mean, the way a press release of the specials, people kind of understood the concept of ska and what they were being sold because it had some kind of history. It wasn't brand new, and you could compartmentalize the group and fit them in.
Absolutely, I think for me the joy of this era, as far as this exercise is concerned, is precisely that you get this bizarre contrast between the groups who were obviously at the cutting edge and knew exactly what they were doing and who they were appealing to, and this strange attempt to sell them by others. I think things got much more in line with each other in the 70s. The people writing for the papers were hipper and younger, and it all ceased to be quite as strangely kind of whack. And so I think whilst one could, of course, do a book of 70s and 80s press releases, I don't think the corresponding reviews and articles would be so interesting in comparison.
No, maybe.
And
not.
also the nature of journalism changed. The first thing you do was go on the road with the band. And that was a completely different kind of story where you just map out what the different characters were and the excitement of the reaction with their audience and everything. And I think things had kind of just moved on journalistically as well.
Yes. Yeah, I'm sure you're right. Something you said earlier, which about still having your Kate Bush press release and people collecting these and so on. I mean, of course, they were, as you said at the beginning, just thrown away, these things. That was the whole point, is that they literally were scraps of paper. But those that happen to survive obviously do contain some really interesting stuff. And I think people will become more interested in them as such. But I said that not many people buy them, but I had an interesting experience recently, which a couple of years ago. A guy was selling a batch of these Decca press releases on eBay, and they were all 99p, and some of them went up to £3, £6, whatever. There was one for Olivia Newton-John's first single, which was on Decca, which was in 1966, 7, something like that, earlier than one might think anyway. And that one suddenly leapt up to £900 because clearly Olivia Newton-John has fans who will. So you do get that effect sometimes with this, and you can't predict which ones will be of massive interest to specific
That's
collectors.
astonishing, actually.
It's absolutely
because I don't know what you do with that apart from to get your 900 quid's worth out of it. You've got to kind of frame it and put it on the wall. And I don't know how thrilling that is as something to look at, really. A press
No, I
release.
agree. It's because it's not like an
I can
album.
understand it with a sleeve or an autograph or something like that. There's a story there.
Yes, yeah, I agree.
So have you got filing cabinets full of this stuff?
No, I just put them in the covers,
Right.
the albums. I mean, my interest in them is not spending a fortune on them so I can have them. No one else can. I mean, all of the stuff I do in this area is to do with wanting to share and proliferate and, make stuff available to people. I wish I knew more people who kept these, but the BBC chucked them away. EMI chucked them away. Decca chucked them away. So what survives by accident, which is quite fun, really. You just, as I say in the beginning of the book, the 5 Leaves Left press release by Nick Drake is in the book, and the Pink Moon one is. Brighter Later isn't. And the reason is no one seems to have a copy of that. It would have existed. Ireland sent out press releases for everything. I know what it would have looked like, but no one's got it. I've asked everyone. Eventually one will come up, maybe.
Yeah, but also there was the postal strike, wasn't there, with Brighter Later?
That is exactly true.
May account for...
That's right. That was one of their reasons why they said it didn't sell very well, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, it was a 3-month postal strike.
3-day week and all that would coincide with it.
Before the 3-day week, but it was a 3-month postal strike when it was supposed to come out, which is why it says on the sleeve that it's 1970, but it was actually 71, I think, something like that. But I found this absolutely fascinating.
It really is.
I really did.
How are you going to let the kind of people who would like to buy that, apart from doing things like this, obviously, know that it exists? I mean,
it's a word of mouth thing, really.
Right, record fairs and stuff like that.
Just people find the website and buy a copy if they want it. I mean, we've it's a limited run, so we printed 1,000 of them, and they'll go to people who want them eventually, I think, is the answer.
Yeah.
But, print advertising for something like this is a bit of a waste of time, and
a complete waste of time.
And I think really it's a question of it slowly spreading, and people may be thinking that that's something nice to have on the shelf, and when it's gone, and all that sort of stuff.
It'll need a pretty robust shelf to hold out, let me tell you.
I lost a whole afternoon when it arrived. just could not put it down. Absolutely gripping. Dave and I kept ringing each other up and saying, "Well, do you remember Fresh Maggots? A group called I don't remember them at all, but apparently they were quite big."
Yeah, if you're a visitor to the British Library and you're feeling that the old copies of the Melody Maker are flaking in your hands, this is a solution to that problem, because here it all is in pristine form. It's absolutely fantastic.
Well, thank you. I think the existence of groups like Fresh Maggots is just an example of how wonderfully prolific the music industry was then. There were demonstrably too many records coming out for all of them to have had anything like success. And there are still ones where you think, I've never seen that before. And I don't know how long that process can possibly go on for. Just seems incredible.
It continues to amaze me when I think that in my young life, my teenage years and my 20s, there was not a day I didn't go in a record shop. Not a day. Apart from when they were closed, I went to record shops all the time. And I always looked at new releases. And so I always knew everything. And then I still see stuff that somebody goes, that came out in 1972. I've never heard of it. Never. Small label, possibly, that kind of thing, It's amazing how much stuff still emerges, from the murk.
Yeah, well, some of those things you say were probably local bands and only singles and only available in, I don't know, the Midlands or something.
I don't know, because this is before kind of do it yourself, really. Everything was on a label that would be nationally available, but it just might not have crossed your path at all, which is absolutely extraordinary.
Well, it's a terrific book.
And
we thoroughly enjoyed it.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Thank you. And I think there's another volume to be done on the American stuff, because this is purely British.
Oh, right.
And that's equally entertaining and strange.
Oh, that's interesting. Is there a difference in tone in the American press releases that's obvious?
America is such a vastly bigger market that they're slightly blander and slightly less idiomatic, and there's a slightly smaller assumption of shared references. But no, Columbia Records was cranking these things out just as much as we were. And they tended to brag about the people's achievements and so on a bit more kind of loudly, the bullet points. But obviously America had far more radio stations and an FM culture that we didn't have. So there was absolutely masses of paper flying around to promote these records in America.
Well, we look forward
what survives, one simply doesn't know, and that's the fun of it. Until something resurfaces, you didn't know it existed. Whereas with a rare record, it's out there. You just hope to find it one day or to be able to get your hands on one. Whereas with these, you just do not know what was ever out there until you see it. And that goes for posters as well as,
I can't wait to read the press release for the Sir Douglas Quintet or whatever it is. That'd be good. Very nice to talk to you. Thanks, Richard, very much.
Thank you so much for having me on.